Oars, axes, terror, then the sound of paradise burning. October 8, 44 AD. 3,000 Viking warriors sailing toward Seville with one purpose: take everything that wasn't nailed down and burn the rest. Facing them, 60,000 civilians, stone walls that had never fallen, and the military might of the Umayyad Caliphate stretching from Spain to North Africa. The cultural collision was total. Pagan Northmen who believed Valhalla awaited versus Muslims who believed paradise was promised. Viking axes versus Moorish curved swords. Dragon ships versus a civilization that had never heard the word Viking. But here's what makes this siege truly extraordinary. The Muslims won the battle, but lost something far more precious. By the end, you'll understand how 54 ships terrorized an empire, why Seville's fall echoed across the Mediterranean for a century, and how one raid forced Islam to build its first Atlantic navy. Before we descend into 7 days of the most audacious riverine assault in medieval warfare, hit that subscribe button for medieval spirits. Because what you're about to discover is how 3,000 Vikings aboard 54 longships with revolutionary 3-foot draft sailed 60 miles up the Guadalquivir River that Mediterranean warships requiring 8 10 feet couldn't navigate, reaching Seville with 60,000 civilians and 2,000 garrison who'd never seen dragon ships. How, on October 1st, the Vikings burned suburbs, killing 2,000 and enslaving 500, then destroyed a 500 cavalry sortie in 10 minutes. Fewer than 200 survived the shield wall slaughter. How days 2 through 4 brought psychological warfare. Vikings sorted captives within sight of walls, executed men who refused service, held feasts visible to defenders. How October 5th's latter assault was reconnaissance, losing 50 Vikings while identifying the weak southern gate. How October 6th Vikings built fire ships. And how October 7th at dawn 3 fire ships with 30-foot flames breached the gate. Vikings sacked the Great Mosque, stripping gold from sacred texts. Then conducted fighting withdrawal when Emir Abd al-Rahman II's 15,000 relief force arrived. 500-man rear guard held 3 hours with only 100 surviving. This is how shallow draft technology and psychological warfare defeated civilization's walls, forcing Islam to build its first Atlantic navy. Now, let's go back to October 1st and watch 3,000 pagans sail where no warship should reach. By 844 AD, the Umayyad Caliphate had transformed Spain into something Europe hadn't seen since Rome fell. Al-Andalus wasn't just a kingdom, it was a civilization that made Christian Europe look like a collection of mud-walled villages by comparison. While Frankish peasants huddled in wooden hovels, the citizens of Cordoba walked streets paved with stone and lit by oil lamps. While European monks copied manuscripts in freezing scriptoriums, Islamic scholars in Toledo translated Greek philosophy in libraries containing hundreds of thousands of books. This was the golden age of Islam, and nowhere shone brighter than Spain. Consider the scale. Cordoba held 500,000 souls, making it the largest city in Western Europe. Its great mosque could hold 40,000 worshippers beneath arches that seemed to float on forests of marble columns. The city boasted 700 public baths, 300 mosques, and running water flowing through aqueducts perfected by Islamic engineering. But Seville was the jewel in this crown of wonders. Sitting on the Guadalquivir River 60 miles inland from the Atlantic coast, Seville in 844 AD held approximately 60,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the Western Mediterranean. The city's wealth came from geography and agriculture. The river connected it to the sea, allowing trade goods to flow in from Africa and the east, while surrounding countryside irrigated by Islamic engineering produced olives, wheat, and oranges in quantities that fed cities and filled treasuries. The Great Mosque of Seville rose above the city like a mountain of white stone and red brick. Markets overflowed with silks from Damascus, spices from India, Gold from Africa, Seville's defenses matched its wealth. Stone walls 20 feet high ringed the city, built on Roman foundations and maintained by Moorish engineers. Towers studded the walls at regular intervals, manned by archers. The garrison numbered perhaps 2,000 professional soldiers, cavalrymen, trained in Moorish mounted archery and swift maneuver. Most importantly, Seville sat 60 miles upriver. The Guadalquivir was navigable by small boats and barges, but sandbars and shallow sections meant no warship could reach the city, or so the Moors believed. But here's where it gets insane. While Al-Andalus built libraries and perfected irrigation, something very different was happening in the frozen north. The Vikings had perfected a technology that would change the medieval world. The longship wasn't just a boat, it was a weapon that could strike anywhere there was water deep enough to float a barrel. A Viking longship measured 60 to 80 feet long, powered by 30 to 60 oars and a single square sail. But what made it revolutionary was the draft. A fully loaded longship carrying 50 warriors and their equipment drew only 3 feet of water. 3 feet. A Mediterranean warship needed 8 to 10 feet. Roman galleys had needed even more. This meant Vikings could sail up rivers that other nations considered impossible barriers, beach their ships on any shoreline, and be fighting within minutes, raid deep inland and escape before armies could muster. And in spring 844, a fleet of 54 longships departed from Scandinavia, hunting for a prize worth the 2,000-mile journey. When they reached the mouth of the Guadalquivir in late September, Viking scouts saw something that made every warrior's heart beat faster. The dragon ships turned east and began rowing upriver. 54 vessels carrying approximately 3,000 warriors, moving at steady pace against the current. The shallow draft that made Mediterranean admirals laugh meant Vikings could navigate sections of river where Moorish vessels ran aground. Local fishermen saw them coming and fled to warn the cities, but the words they used made no sense to Moorish officials. Ships with dragon heads, tall warriors with yellow hair and axes, pagans who don't fear God. The officials dismissed the reports as peasant panic. Probably Christian pirates from the north. The garrison could handle pirates. As the longships approached Seville in the first days of October 844, the watchmen on the walls finally saw what the fishermen had tried to describe. 54 vessels moving in disciplined formation, dragon prows cutting through water, oars rising and falling with mechanical precision. The garrison commander ordered the gates sealed and sent urgent messages to Cordoba, but messages would take days to arrive and more days for relief forces to assemble. Seville was on its own. The Vikings beached their longships on the riverbank south of the city, just beyond arrow range of the walls. Then they did something that would haunt Muslim nightmares for generations. They planted their feet, raised their shields, and began the war cries of the north. 3,000 voices raised in pagan battle songs that spoke of Odin and Thor and Valhalla, the sound carrying across the water and over the walls like thunder promising storm. Inside Seville, 60,000 civilians and 2,000 soldiers waited behind stone walls that had never been breached. They had food for months, water from wells, faith that Allah would protect the faithful from northern demons. What they didn't have was experience fighting warriors who viewed death as victory and saw their golden city as nothing more than the world's most beautiful target. You're probably wondering how stone walls 20 feet high could fall to raiders with no siege engines. The answer was about to demonstrate that Vikings didn't need sophisticated equipment. They needed fire, patience, and the willingness to make psychological warfare as deadly as physical combat. Dawn broke on October 1st, 844 AD. The citizens of Seville woke to a sight that defied comprehension. 54 dragon ships lined the riverbank like a fence of serpents, their carved prows staring at the city with painted eyes that seemed almost alive. Behind them, 3,000 Vikings formed into ordered ranks, their round shields creating a wall of color. their axes catching the morning sun like a forest of steel. The garrison commander made his assessment. The walls were strong, the garrison professional. These northern barbarians had no siege engines, no towers, no apparent plan beyond showing up with axes and attitude. He was about to learn why Vikings didn't need siege engines. The first attack came at mid-morning, not against the walls, but against the suburbs outside the city proper. Seville, like most medieval cities, had grown beyond its walls. Markets, workshops, homes for the poor sprawled across land outside the stone defenses, holding perhaps 10,000 people who had no protection beyond distance and hope. The Vikings fell on them like wolves on sheep, and the garrison commander was about to make the fatal mistake that would cost him 500 of his best cavalry. What happened next still haunts the Arabic chronicles. The raiding parties moved with practiced efficiency, breaking into groups of 50 to 100 men, each targeting specific sectors. They weren't disorganized barbarians, they were professionals, executing a plan perfected from Ireland to Francia. The killing was mechanical. Moorish civilians who fought died quickly under axe blows. Those who fled were run down by warriors who had spent their lives training for exactly this kind of work. But the Vikings weren't just killing, they were sorting. Old men and women with no value as slaves were cut down. Young men and women of breeding age were captured, bound, and herded toward the ships. Children above age 8, valuable in slave markets, were taken. The mathematics of slavery were brutal and precise. By noon of the first day, the suburbs were burning, Vikings having set fire to everything they couldn't carry, creating walls of flame and smoke visible for miles. The message was clear: resist and watch everything burn, or surrender and perhaps survive as property. From the walls of Seville, the garrison and civilians watched their world burn. The screams of the dying carried on the wind, the smoke stung their eyes and throats, and through it all they could hear Vikings singing battle songs in a language that sounded like rocks grinding together, punctuated by the rhythmic crash of axes on shields. Here's where the garrison commander's confidence became catastrophic overconfidence. He ordered a sortie, 500 cavalry, the pride of the Moorish military, armed with curved swords and composite bows, mounted on horses bred for desert warfare. They would ride out, scatter these barbarian raiders, and show them what real warriors looked like. The gates opened. The cavalry charged. The Vikings were ready. Picture this from a Moorish cavalryman's perspective. You're part of an elite force that's never known defeat, charging at full gallop toward what appears to be disorganized raiders. Suddenly, the raiders close ranks into a shield wall, round shields overlapping, creating a wooden barrier studded with steel bosses and bound with iron. The front rank kneels, bracing shields against the ground. The second rank stands, shields raised. The third rank holds axes at ready. You realize too late that you can't stop your momentum on soft riverbank soil. As the Moorish horsemen thundered toward them, the Viking shield wall held position. The charge hit like a wave hitting a cliff. Horses, unable to stop their momentum, crashed into the barrier. Some tried to leap it, some reared and threw their riders. The Vikings waited for exactly this moment of chaos. Then the axes came out. What happened next was butchery elevated to art form. The two-handed Dane axes swung by men trained since childhood, carved through horseflesh and human bodies with equal ease. The sound wet and meaty and final. Horses screamed and thrashed, their blood steaming in the cool morning air. Riders who fell were finished on the ground, with quick axe blows to neck or skull. The sortie that was supposed to scatter barbarians lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Of 500 cavalry who charged out, fewer than 200 made it back inside the gates. The rest lay dead or dying on the riverbank, while Vikings methodically finished the wounded and stripped the dead of armor and weapons. The garrison commander watched from the walls and felt the first cold finger of doubt. These weren't disorganized raiders. These were soldiers who understood formation fighting and knew exactly how to counter cavalry. By end of day 1, the suburbs were ash. Approximately 2,000 civilians were dead. Another 500 had been taken captive. The sortie had failed catastrophically, and Vikings had established complete blockade of the river. But the psychological warfare was only beginning, and what came next would prove that sometimes terror defeats walls better than battering rams. On day 2, the Vikings demonstrated their understanding of psychological warfare. They brought the captives within sight of the walls and began sorting them again. Women and children deemed valuable were loaded onto ships. Men of fighting age were given a choice: convert to service with the Vikings or die. Most chose death. The Vikings respected that, killing them quickly without torture, then stacking the bodies where the garrison could see them. The message was elegant in its brutality. Resistance has a price, and we will make you watch us collect it. The garrison archers on the walls tried to disrupt this horror. Arrows arced toward the Vikings, but at 200 yards, even the best Moorish bows struggled for accuracy. The Vikings simply raised their shields and continued their work. By day 3, the pattern had become clear. Vikings weren't trying to storm the walls immediately. They were starving the city, breaking its spirit, making it clear that no help was coming. Every morning they conducted raids on outlying farms and villages, returning with more captives and more plunder. Every evening they held feasts within sight of the walls, roasting sheep and cattle they had taken, drinking captured wine, singing their pagan songs. The psychological impact was devastating. Inside the walls, food was still plentiful, but morale was crumbling. The civilians had never seen enemies like this, warriors who laughed while they worked, who showed no fear of death, who treated the siege like a celebration. On day 4, Vikings changed tactics. They began probing the walls themselves, looking for weak points. Small groups would approach under cover of shields, testing the gates, examining the foundations, studying defensive positions. The garrison archers would drive them back, but each probe revealed more information. The Vikings were learning the city's defenses with the patience of craftsmen studying a lock. Meanwhile, the messengers Seville had sent to Cordoba on day 1 had finally reached the capital. Emir Abd al-Rahman II received the news with the shock it deserved. Northern barbarians besieging one of his major cities, pagans who had sailed up a river and attacked the heart of Al-Andalus. He immediately ordered a relief force, assembled 15,000 men, cavalry and infantry, the largest army he could muster quickly. But assembling that many troops, gathering supplies, and marching 250 miles would take time. Minimum 10 days, more likely 2 weeks, Seville would have to hold. On day 5, Vikings demonstrated why their reputation had spread terror across Europe. They brought siege ladders, not sophisticated siege engines, just simple wooden ladders. At dawn, 500 Vikings formed up in close formation, shields raised against the arrows that began falling immediately, and charged the eastern wall. The assault was coordinated chaos. Vikings reached the wall, threw up their ladders, and began climbing while their companions held shields overhead, protecting them from arrows raining down. For 3 hours, the battle raged along 100 yards of wall. Vikings climbed. Moors pushed them back. More Vikings climbed. The stone walkway became slick, with blood from both sides. But here's what the garrison didn't understand. This wasn't the real attack. This was reconnaissance in force. The Vikings were testing response time, measuring defender strength, identifying which sections of wall were most heavily defended and which were vulnerable. By noon, Vikings pulled back, having lost perhaps 50 men, but they had learned everything they needed to know. That night, as Seville tended its wounded and buried its dead, Viking commanders held council. They had identified the weak point. The southern gate, where the wall met the river, was less heavily defended. The garrison had concentrated forces on eastern approaches, assuming that's where main assault would come. They were wrong, and the Vikings were about to introduce fire to the equation. On day 6, Vikings began assembling their forces along the southern approach. The garrison, realizing too late what was happening, rushed troops to reinforce the southern wall. But the Vikings had already decided on something more direct. They were going to burn their way in. As the sun set on day 6, Viking work parties began constructing something that made the garrison's blood run cold: fire ships. They were taking their smaller boats, filling them with everything flammable they could find: oil, dried grass, wood, soaked in animal fat, and preparing to set them loose against the river gate. The garrison knew what was coming. If those fire ships reached the river gate and ignited, the wooden portions of the gate structure would burn, and when the gate burned, the Vikings would pour through. You're probably wondering how 3 fire ships could breach walls that had stood for centuries. The answer was about to demonstrate that sometimes the simplest tactics are the most devastating when executed with perfect timing. On the morning of day 7, the Vikings made their move. The fire ships were set ablaze and pushed toward the river gate on the morning current. Behind them, 54 longships filled with warriors began rowing hard toward the southern wall. The garrison archers fired everything they had at the fire ships, trying to sink them before they reached the gate. Some arrows found their marks, some ships sank or veered off course, but 3 fire ships reached the gate and exploded into walls of flame that reached 30 feet high. The wooden gate structure caught immediately. The iron reinforcements held for a few minutes, then began to warp and sag from the heat. The stone around the gate cracked from thermal shock, and then, with a sound like thunder, the southern gate collapsed inward. 3,000 Vikings roared as one and charged. Picture this from the garrison's perspective. You've defended for 6 days, held every assault, maintained discipline. Suddenly, your southern gate, which you thought was secure because it meets the river, explodes in 30-foot flames. The wooden structure you've relied on for generations collapses in minutes. And through the smoke and fire pour 3,000 warriors who've spent a week preparing for exactly this moment. The breach was chaos made flesh. Vikings poured through the collapsed southern gate like water through a broken dam, their war cries shaking the morning air, their axes already red with blood from defenders who had tried to hold the choke point. The narrow streets of Seville, designed for merchants and scholars, became killing corridors where Moorish discipline collided with Viking fury. The garrison commander threw everything he had at the breach. 500 men formed a desperate shield wall 3 streets back from the gate, trying to contain the flood of Northmen. Moorish archers on rooftops rained arrows down into the press of bodies. Cavalry tried to charge through side streets, using mobility to strike Viking flanks. None of it was enough. In the narrow streets, there was no room for horse maneuver, no space for the elegant sword work that Moorish warriors had perfected, just brutal face-to-face murder with axes that could cleave through helmet and skull in a single blow. Young Ahmad, a 16-year-old militia member whose name appears in one Arabic chronicle, found himself facing a Viking giant who stood head and shoulders above him. The Norseman's beard braided with silver wire, his arms thick as tree trunks, his axe already dripping with blood of Ahmad's friends. For 3 heartbeats, they stared at each other. The Viking's axe took his head off in one stroke before Ahmad could even raise his blade. But then came the moment that would decide whether Vikings kept their plunder or died trying. By mid-morning, Vikings had advanced 3 streets into the city. Bodies lay everywhere, Moor and Viking both testament to how hard each side was willing to fight. The invaders had lost perhaps 200 men, more than they'd lost in all the previous 6 days combined. The defenders had lost twice that, but they were trading space for casualties, making Vikings bleed for every street. Then, Vikings reached the Great Mosque. The Mosque of Seville wasn't the massive structure that would be built later, but it was still magnificent. White stone walls inlaid with Arabic calligraphy praising Allah, a courtyard with fountains where the faithful performed ablutions before prayer, a minaret rising toward heaven calling believers to worship 5 times daily. It was the spiritual heart of the city, the place where heaven touched earth. The Vikings saw gold. The doors were barred from inside, defended by 50 men who had sworn to die before letting pagans defile sacred ground. The Vikings didn't bother negotiating. They brought up their fire ship's remaining oil, splashed it against the doors, and set it ablaze. When the doors collapsed, they charged through smoke and flames into the courtyard beyond. Not Moorish drums, not the call to prayer, the deep, rhythmic thunder of Viking war drums beaten with a cadence that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound meant reinforcements. More longships had arrived, or the Vikings who had stayed with the ships were now advancing to support their brothers. The garrison's counterattack stalled, then broke, then became a rout as men realized they were now fighting fresh Viking warriors while already exhausted. By noon, organized Moorish resistance had collapsed. What remained were pockets of desperate men fighting to the death, and thousands of civilians hiding in homes, praying that the northern demons would pass them by. The plunder began in earnest. Vikings spread through the city, kicking in doors, dragging families into streets, sorting the living by value. Conservative estimates suggest Vikings took between 8,000 and 10,000 captives during the sack of Seville, 1 out of every 6 people in the city, enslaved in a single afternoon. The killing was selective but savage. Garrison soldiers who surrendered were executed because armed men were dangerous, and feeding prisoners was expensive. Wealthy men who tried to hide their gold were tortured until they revealed it, then killed. But as Vikings loaded their ships with gold and 8,000 enslaved humans, the sentries posted outside the city began shouting warnings. Dust clouds on the northern road. Many dust clouds, the kind raised by thousands of horses moving fast. Amir Abd al-Rahman's relief army, 15,000 men, had arrived. The Vikings were now trapped inside a hostile city with a professional army approaching and only one escape route back through the burning streets to their ships on the river. What happened next would prove Viking reputation was earned not just in attack, but in withdrawal under pressure. The Viking commanders made their assessment in minutes. They couldn't hold the city against 15,000 fresh troops. They couldn't escape with all the plunder. They couldn't save all the captives. They had to choose die rich or escape alive with what they could carry. They chose life, but they would make the emir pay for it. The Viking fighting withdrawal was a masterpiece of tactical discipline under pressure. They formed their captives into columns, put the most valuable plunder on carts, and began pulling back toward the river in organized units. The rear guard, 500 of their best warriors, formed a shield wall across the main avenue leading south, blocking the Moorish advance. The emir's cavalry hit that shield wall like a hammer striking an anvil, and, like an anvil, the Vikings refused to break. They gave ground slowly, step by step, making the Moors pay in blood for every yard. The two-handed axes carved through horses and riders alike. The shield wall, constantly reforming as men fell, maintained cohesion through sheer discipline and the knowledge that breaking meant death for everyone. As the sun set on day 7, the last Viking longships pushed off from the riverbank, their decks packed with warriors, captives, and plunder. Moorish archers on the walls and banks fired everything they had, but the range was too great for accuracy. A few Vikings fell, arrows sprouting from backs and shoulders. A few captives died, caught in the same arrow storm. But the bulk of the fleet escaped intact, rowing hard downriver toward the sea, carrying enough wealth to make every warrior rich and enough slaves to flood the Dublin market for months. Behind them, Seville burned. The great mosque was violated. 10,000 citizens were gone, enslaved, or dead. The richest city in Western Europe had been humbled by 3,000 pagans who had sailed up a river that shouldn't have been navigable. The emir's army rode into a city of smoke and weeping. They had saved Seville, but they had saved a corpse. As the smoke cleared, Seville counted its dead and discovered that numbers alone couldn't capture the horror. 4,000 citizens killed, 8,000 to 10,000 enslaved, the great mosque defiled, entire neighborhoods burned to ash. But the real damage went deeper than mathematics could measure. October 844 AD. 3,000 Vikings aboard 54 longships sailed 60 miles up the Guadalquivir River to attack Seville. 60,000 civilians and 2,000 garrison defending stone walls that had never fallen. By October 7th sunset, Vikings escaped with 8,000 to 10,000 enslaved civilians and massive plunder after 7 days, proving that shallow draft technology defeats civilization's assumptions. The mathematics revealed devastating truth. Longships drawing 3 feet of water could navigate rivers requiring 8 to 10 feet for Mediterranean warships. 500 Moorish cavalry charging the shield wall were reduced to fewer than 200 survivors in 10 minutes. 3 fire ships with 30-foot flames breached gates that had stood for centuries. 500-man Viking rear guard held 3 hours with only 100 surviving to give their brothers time to escape. Subscribe to Medieval Spirits and share this video so others understand how technological innovation defeats assumptions about defensive security. Leave a comment telling me which modern operation best demonstrates Viking principles. Shallow draft riverine penetration, psychological warfare through visible brutality, fighting withdrawal under pressure, and force multiplication through mobility. Because here's the real lesson from Seville. When 3,000 raiders with superior river technology face 60,000 defenders, assuming geography provides safety, the question isn't about courage or walls, it's about who understands that 3 feet of draft defeats 8 feet of assumption. Vikings chose fire ships over battering rams, psychological torture over patient siege, fighting withdrawal over suicidal last stands. 7 days later, 8,000 enslaved civilians and Islam's first Atlantic Navy proved that sometimes paradise learns to build warships when pagans come sailing upriver. Sometimes sophistication means nothing when the wolves arrive on ships that shouldn't float in 3 feet of water.